A very warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and for some probably already good early evening. Welcome to the second day and the afternoon of the Business and Human Rights Forum, and we're going to have a session today which is talking about what gets measured, gets managed. And we're going to have a discussion around transparency and accountability to advance women's economic empowerment in Asia and the Pacific. I'm welcoming you on behalf of two really important programs in our region who are really working around this topic, which is UN Women's WeEmpowerAsia program and ILO managed programs, Responsible Supply Chain in Asia. And both of these programs are supported and funded by the European Union, and we will be hearing a little bit more about this in a second. But before I'm turning to what we have to talk about, I would love to hear who is in the room and who's joining us today, because we want to make sure that this session is as interactive as possible. I'm going to use this momentum to also explain a couple of house rules, because we are at a new platform. The ones that have joined the other sessions will be already very familiar with, but we might have also new guests today to the Business and Human Rights Forum. The platform we are using has different functions. If you need any translations, there's on the bottom a frame which says floor, and there's a drop-down menu where you can choose the language that you need for translations. We also do have a very active field or multiple fields on the right on Q&As, but also one which is called tasks. And I would like to ask everyone to just go there now. And we have two little polls. We would love to hear from where you're joining us today. And also we would love to hear what type of organization you are joining us from today. So you will be seeing this. I won't see this yet before you have answered, but you will see the two questions in the task field. And I hope that's going to give us a little bit more an idea who is directly in the room. Having said that, we're also going to have some audience joining us over YouTube and Facebook. So the session is streamed. Also just saying if there are any Q&As. Oh, I see we have already some results, and great to see that we have white representation from South Asia, Southeast Asia. We have also colleagues from Europe, which I think is also the nature of the two programs, that we have quite a lot of stakeholders and partners that probably joining us today. No surprise, it's still a little bit early in the Americas. So next to that, do we have already any results on from what sectors? Oh, that looks very colorful, and I think that's what we also want to see, is a colorful representation from multiple sectors. As I said, probably that doesn't reflect the full audience, since we are really live streaming also on other channels. And what we have seen in other sessions, mainly the audience is really joining us also from direct links over YouTube. Now, thank you very much for this. I really want to keep up this level of interaction as well throughout the session. Just before I go into sharing a little bit more about the program, just about myself. My name is Katja Freiwald, and I am UN Women's Regional Program Manager for WeEmpowerAsia. And I will be moderating this session today, but I will be not talking a lot. We have a really exciting panel that we're going to be listening to later, but we also have a very exciting presentation and some research that we're going to be sharing today. With that, I would just like to really share 2 seconds about the two programs that actually have been working together to put not only that session together, but also really work together to present today a new research that we have been conducting. So on the one hand, my colleagues from ILO, who are really leading the Responsible Supply Chains program in collaboration with OECD, and as I said before, funded and in partnership with the European Union, which is really looking into furthering sustainable development and inclusive economic progress by integrating responsible business conduct into enterprises, but also into policy-making processes. And as the word said, is very strongly looking into supply chains. And the second program, which is the WeEmpowerAsia program, which I'm leading, is actually a very nice complement to that responsible supply chain program, because our program is really seeking to increase women's economic participation across these entire value chains or trade chains from Asia to Europe, from Europe to Asia, and both programs together really had a very good positioning to bring up a new research, which my colleagues will be sharing in a second. The core of the program WeEmpowerAsia, one of the elements that we are really focusing on, as I said is really getting more women into business or equally participate in the economy. But one way to do this is we're strongly working with companies, with enterprises, as I said, across these value chains. And one framework that we are using to really drive the gender lens into these supply chains is the framework of the Women's Empowerment Principles, which we won't have time today to go really into depth, but it's a framework of 7 principles that are looking really from high corporate leadership, but really looking into workplace principles. How can women equally participate in the workplace? How can women equally participate in the diverse supply chains? How do companies source their products? How do they market them? And all of that, how to bring a gender lens to that. And one of the last principles, the principle 7, which is going to be a bit of the heart of our conversation today, is really on how can we make sure that we get more transparency and accountability into companies, into economies when it comes to gender equality. We have heard a lot on transparency already around business and human rights, but women's rights very strongly belong to that. So we're going to have really a zoom in on that today. And that's why we also have created a report and a research over the past year, so a very thorough piece of long-term research, which really has helped us to bring an ecosystem landscaping together and really focus on and look on how can we advance accountability and transparency across the women's empowerment principles. So we have taken 2 lenses for this research, and my colleague Aparajita is going to be more elegantly talk about this in a second. But there's a geographical scope. So we have been looking at ASEAN countries because we also want to use our partnership and collaboration with ASEAN member states to bring some of these findings forward and really make this an applicable research. So this is one lens, a geographical element. And the second lens, as I said, is really looking into the women's empowerment principles as a framework. So what we have been doing is we have structured the full report and the ecosystem analysis, looking at public sector, looking at private sector, but really looking at the different areas that are captured in the women's empowerment principles. And I'm not going to go into more depth on that. I would love to use the opportunity to hand it over to actually an organization and a colleague who's representing this organization, Value for Women, who has been really instrumental in working with us on putting that very thorough piece of research together.
Thank you, Katja. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aprajita Agarwal, and I'm based out of India as the Director for Strategy and Development at Value for Women. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to present the research report that has been developed jointly with UN Women and ILO and co-authored by Value for Women. The report, as Katja mentioned, seeks to gain a comprehensive understanding of the current landscape and generate recommendations for enhanced action. What we set out to do was to develop a framework that would take the WEPs, the Women Empowerment Principles that Katja just talked about, that were created for the private sector, and make a matching framework for the public sector, which we have named the WEP Public Policy Framework. So what we really did for each of the WEP categories was that we looked at a series of indicators, mainly around policy, laws, and international commitment that ASEAN member states are working on, And that's one piece of the report. The other piece is really focused on building the spirit of transparency and accountability. So we not only looked at what governments are doing, but also looked at what regulators like stock exchange and security exchange councils are doing to promote gender equality. We assessed if they were providing any kind of mandates or guidance for each of the stock exchanges or SECs in each of the member states. So this is really the first study report that looks at a comprehensive value chain approach framed around the WEPs to assess both public and private sector in ASEAN and provide some clear collective action areas. Moving on to the next slide, let's reflect on why the reporting on gender equality is important and how does this contribute to business and human rights agenda. Well, we think by increasing transparency in business practices, we can foment gender inclusion because companies are in a way both forced and incentivized to report on gender and also work towards and compare themselves to their peers. And in creating these benchmarks, they can not only compare themselves to their peers, but identify good practices and set new standards of transparency around gender issues. And then this whole cycle repeats itself and continues to build a good foundation for moving ahead. In the next slide, we'll try to go a little deeper to understand what really is the WEP public policy roadmap. So the WEP public policy roadmap, as we have outlined on the next slide, is a single conceptual framework of national commitment and public sector policies, mandates and partnerships that cover each of the key WEP areas that we have mentioned earlier. What it does is assess each member state on their current public policies around gender equality in the private sector. I'd like to highlight here that we only looked at gender equality in the private sector and not gender equality in general. There are a lot of entities out there that are looking at gender equality in general. And then there is the whole area around benchmarking progress. So what we are able to do with this is benchmark different ASEAN member states and identify opportunities for growth and change. In the next slide, we won't go into a lot of details on all of the indicators, but we'll let you read and explore this at your leisure later when you read through the report. But what you can see here is that we did touch upon some of the key issues that we saw emerge. The first WEP, for example, had to do with high-level corporate leadership. So on the private sector side, that has to do with affirming your support usually by the CEO and or the board on gender equality issues, setting strategies and goals publicly. On the public sector front, for countries, this means reaffirming the international commitment that each country has in relation to international treaties, such as the ILO conventions. And then what we also added here is gender responsive budgeting, which basically means assigning or ensuring that all the national accounts and budgets are looked at from gender perspective. And you basically identify how much money is going towards gender responsive or gender related activities and policies. In WEPs 2, here, for example, we go into what exactly companies are doing to promote gender inclusion within the organizations. The counterpart for that, obviously, in the public sector is the enabling environment around the laws, pay, daycare, parenthood, and programs that promote pay equity, and as well as national action plans on business and human rights, which include some gender-related issues. In WEPs 3, this has to do with sexual harassment, and here we look at the public and the private sector aspects of that. Again, in the interest of time, I won't be walking you through all of them, but to quickly glance through WEPs 4 and 5, we look at how countries and governments are supporting or enabling the presence of women in non-traditional vocations in profession or education, such as STEM fields. WEP 5, we look at everything that has to do with entrepreneurship. So from a government perspective, that could have to do with any policies or programs that are seeking to incentivize procurement from women-led businesses, but also national financial inclusion strategies and how they include or do not include gender equality objectives. And then finally, that WEPs also touch upon gender stereotypes, policies, and types of marketing strategies, etc. And the last two WEPs have to do with community initiatives and advocacy. So here's what we looked at, that the presence of public-private partnership in each country and how the government is participating in these and helping lead each initiative. Finally, we looked at any gender-related mandates that regulators have put in place in their countries to incentivize gender-related reporting by companies. On the next slide, we'll talk about looking at what for each of the WEPs, whether the countries needed to prioritize, deepen, or sustain their progress based on the different indicators in each of these areas. And before we go on to some of the findings, we wanted to do a quick word cloud exercise here, and we would like to pose a question that you should be able to see on your screen now. And to answer this question, simply navigate to the right side of the screen. You'll see a button for tasks where the question is also written, and you can write your answers in 1 to 3 words there. The answers or the responses that you type there will show up in the word cloud that we'll shortly show you. The tech facilitators will help pull this through, so I'm hoping that you are able to find the task button on the right side of the screen and create this. Oh, this is interesting. So all your responses are showing up here in the word cloud, and you can see this cloud is really growing as more of you write your responses here. Thank you for participating in this exercise. All right, we'll move to the next slide now, and I'll start focusing on the summary for ASEAN countries. Here you can see a snapshot, and again, we won't go into detail for paucity of time, but this is what it looks like for each of the country. You're able to see that, you're probably able to see that in some of the gray areas, that's where there is a lot of room for growth. This is likely, for example, in the case of WEPs 1, there is a lot of room for growth in the different WEP areas, and different countries have different opportunities for advancements. But as you can see, WEP 3 in particular, which has to do with sexual harassment, is where there is, again, a huge room for growth. The next slide showcases another snapshot of what country-level WEPs policy assessment narrative looks like. And this is where you can see an example of Indonesia that we've pulled up. And again, the report goes into quite a bit of detail around how we have arrived at these. So we'd love to hear about that, more feedback as you read through that report later. The next few slides are going to focus on the findings from the assessments. So we'll do a quick roundup of the findings that we saw on the public sector side and the private sector side. So starting first on the public sector side, we found that many countries haven't signed the key gender equality conventions put forth by the ILO. Now, there are just 5 countries in the region that have laws, legal instruments, national strategies, or program related to gender responsive budgeting, which is great. But there is obviously room for growth in the region within those countries or in other countries that haven't yet started the journey. Most countries mandate equal remuneration for equal work, yet we still have an average pay gap of about 14.8% in the region, and only half the countries offer the recommended paid 14 weeks of maternity leave. Very few offer the recommended parental leave. The next slide, we'll continue to talk about some of the additional findings that we saw in the assessment. Very few countries have specific legislation on preventing sexual harassment at the workplace. So while they might have specific legislation around violence against women or sexual harassment in general, very few have legislation around sexual harassment at the workplace. Also, very few countries have national level professional development programs that are targeted at women. Again, they may have different vocational programs or youth programs, but very few have national level programs that target women. Specifically, very few countries are doing any kind of reporting on this. Our sources of information are what the countries report on in terms of what they're doing and what they report to the UN. So there might be countries that have initiatives or some national initiatives, but if they do not report these publicly or through the different reporting mechanisms to the UN or other annual reports, then we won't know about it. Then the next point is around gender responsive procurement. There is little legislation around this presently. While there are some programs around gender responsive procurement, this isn't bound by policies or legality around it. Now, if you look at the companies that use data from UN Women WEPs tools, we see that not only there isn't any legislation, but few or no countries have initiatives that have gender responsive procurement initiatives in the public sector. We also know that very few companies globally and in the region are developing gender-responsive procurement policies or programs. So there is definite room for growth here. While there are different private sector initiatives to promote gender equality and women's empowerment and women's leadership in the private sector, there is definite potential to have the public sector take more leadership on this front. Going on to the next slide, a few countries have these multi-stakeholder partnerships that include the private sector or are driven by the public sector. Finally, Malaysia has a quota and a mandate for reporting the presence of women on boards. Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore have some sort of guidance for publicly listed companies on how they should report on gender, whether through their annual sustainability reports or sustainability guidelines that the regulators are providing. The next slide provides a quick landscape of the private sector, the next section. And in this section, we'll look at the 75 publicly listed companies in ASEAN. And what we basically looked at is that we defined the top companies in each of the stock exchanges in the countries that we saw. And we tried to have diversity for each of the country. So these are not technically the biggest 75 companies in ASEAN, but rather a mix of the top companies in each country in the region. Going into the findings themselves, what we found was on the next slide that only 4 of the publicly listed companies that we looked at have actually signed the WEPs, compared to 201 total in the region. Now, that's a way of assessing the public commitment towards gender equality. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't large companies in the region that are signing these, but that from the companies that we looked at, from these top listed companies, very few are actually signing the WEPs presently. Probably the indicator that most often gets reported is the number of workers, sex disaggregated, the companies have in the workforce. And again, we think the reason for that is perhaps that a lot of companies reporting is aligned with the GRI or the Global Reporting Initiative. This is one of the key indicators they have in GRI, which is around workforce indicator disaggregated by sex. So that's why you have a lot of companies reporting this, but they're not necessarily reporting this data by levels of hierarchy, roles, etc. So this doesn't really tell us much. Then again, only 7% actually report publicly on what the actual pay gap is. A 4th report not having any gender disparity, but they don't actually report the numbers. So we don't actually know what the pay gap is. Now, this is all really around reporting, and there may be instances where they may be taking action, but they're not reporting them. Only 30% report on gender sensitive recruitment or retention practices. Moving on to my next slide, only 1 company communicated having a sexual harassment reporting mechanism. This isn't even talking about the number of cases of sexual harassment, but just the fact that they even have a mechanism where they say that they were taking action on the issue. So that was very surprising. Also, very few companies are reporting on professional development opportunities for women. And we anticipate that this is because most companies are not taking any specific actions on this. Because if they do have initiatives around this, they would likely be reporting and talking about these. Again, as mentioned earlier, no companies in the region have gender responsive procurement practices, including supplier diversity. And about a 4th report that women and girls are a focus in their community initiatives. So it's not all bleak. The next slide, now if you look at the total, less than half of the companies report on some sort of WEPs related policy or action. So we know that there is intent and there is a lot of room for growth. On the next slide, we'll finally take a look at the stock exchanges, which we mentioned were very much an integral part of this assessment. We looked, what we found out was that 5 out of 9 stock exchanges in the region participated in the UN Women Ring the Bell for Gender Equality initiative this year, which is a way to demonstrate commitment. If we look at the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, as we have mentioned before, they provide guidance on gender reporting, again, as part of general sustainability reporting guidelines. Singapore Exchange and Bursa Malaysia have interesting programs that not only have targets for getting more women on boards, but also have programs to develop a pipeline of women and creating a network of women that are ready to be on boards. Bursa Malaysia has something called the Diversity Experience Program, which is already working on this. So that's kind of summing up what our key findings were. And the next section will talk about recommendations, but for that, I'll hand it back to Katja. Thank you, Katja.
Thank you so much, Aparajita. And I'm back on. I had a little bit of a internet connection issue, but I listened to most of your presentation, and it was very well, and I think very insightful, not only for us here as a panel, but I think also for the audience. I think most of the findings we try to bring into very kind of high-level recommendations. So it was very challenging actually to really get this into something what could be solid and could be really recognized as recommendations moving forward. So we have clustered our recommendations into 3 big areas, and we won't have the chance to go through them all in detail from the research, but we do have a really expert panel with us today who would help us to really go in each of these recommendations a little bit deeper. So the first one is obviously really establishing more high-level commitment, not only at the public sector side, not only at the private sector side, but in general across the different stakeholders. So that commitment at each level is still a very important one to be gained. The second area is really looking on how could we improve the enabling environment for get more women to participate equally in the private sector. So this is the part where Rachita shared on the public policy roadmap. So this roadmap really gives the clear recommendations, and it's very difficult to summarize that or to sum this up in general for all ASEAN countries because it's very specific country per country. But the 3 general areas that we thought are very common is really to ensure and facilitate safe and equal participation of women in the workforce, really looking into developing specific actions to support women in the workforce, how they can develop, how they can really climb the career ladder there as well. And the last piece on this is really looking more at the deeper side of the value chain, also really ensuring that women-owned businesses have equal chances to participate in the supply chains in the marketplace. So really supporting women-owned businesses also as suppliers to come in into markets. And the third area, which I think you have heard a lot about already, is really to move forward or move the needle on transparency in reporting. So really incentivize or mandate reporting for public for private sector companies. So these are the 3 areas. Having said that, we said we really want this to be a very practical piece of work and not a theoretical research only. So we're going to be sharing a couple of tools and hearing from the panel in a second. But before we do this, I would love to hear from the audience when we speak about actions and particularly speaking about also reporting. I would love to hear what are the areas that you think should be really prioritized when it comes to reporting or to action towards more women's participation in the private sector. And we have listed a couple here in the task field again. So you will need to go to that task button, and there are things listed like women in leadership, parental leave, grievance mechanisms and procedures to prevent sexual harassment, equal pay, gender responsive procurement practices, women in non-traditional roles, e.g. STEM and finance, looking into living wages in supply chains, gender disaggregated, mandatory reporting mechanisms. Do we have already data coming in? I can see this very well, but it looks like that there are some really highlights. I'm sorry, I can't read on my screen the chart here very fully, but it looks like there's, yes, now I see it better. There's really, still moving. Yes, so we see quite a colorful picture again. So there's one area which is standing out. I'm sorry that I can't really get this on my screen properly. If the technical team could help us. please. Okay. I hope the audience is able to see this. I think it looks like either equal pay or really preventing sexual harassment from what I can see. Sorry again for very unclear screen from my side. But I think data is one thing, and what we see from you, it's looking really across the spectrum. And that's also, I think, what we have been looking at when we developed our reporting framework on what kind of recommendations or guidance could we provide for private sector companies to really advance gender reporting in their own organizations. And we have developed what's called the WEPs Transparency and Accountability Framework. And my colleagues will be also able to share a link in the chat so that companies joining us today, please download that and have a look in here. But this framework that we have been developing has been exactly doing what I'll just wanted to get out of this little poll from your side. We have been really looking into what are the key essential reporting indicators that we can ask companies to really report on. And the way how we have looked at this, because it is important coming from a company perspective also, and I've been working 15 years in the private sector myself, it's important to really look at what is feasible and what really is essential. So we have been looking at all the indicator frameworks that are out there, like the GRI, Bloomberg, Equilab, Edge, and multiple others. And we've really tried to look on which are the ones now that really are more commonly reported, which are easier to report and which every company could report on. And we also have looked on which are the ones that are really the change makers. So imagine if everyone would really measure them and report on them, and taking the assumption that then also action will follow to make sure that we shift and improve on these indicators. That's where the needle is going to be shifted. And that's what we call the essential reporting indicators. So we have identified 5 key areas of essential indicators. I'm not going to go in all of them. Now we don't have the time for this, but please really have a look at this. And then there's a supporting what we call complementary indicators, which really help companies to go even deeper. But if we could kind of move the needle across the region here to just get alignment behind the first essential indicator, this would be already a big step forward. And I think that was enough of presentation and enough of frameworks and assessments. And I think there's a lot to be read from in the future, but I think I would love to actually really turn into a much more lively discussion and really hearing out of the voices from practitioners, from people that are actually working in this space. And I think we can be very lucky. We do have a very exciting and very knowledgeable panel with us today. I'm just going to introduce everyone very quickly, and then we're going to be going one by one and having just a conversation and seeing what is done in practicality. So I'm really thrilled to have with us today Joni Simpson, who is the gender specialist at the ILO here in Asia Pacific and a very dear colleague of mine. And I'm also very pleased that we have with us today Alba Poon, who is the he's working in the European External Action Service. And Alba is a policy officer and working in the Human Rights Division at the European External Action Service. And we will be hearing more from her experience also in Asia, where she's been working for quite some time as well. And I'm really thrilled that we do have Nadia Zainuddin with us today, who is the Deputy General Manager of the Security Commission to Malaysia. And we've heard from Aparajita already that Malaysia has really done very good practices and really interesting things to share for other regions, for other countries as well. And we do have with us another powerful woman, Katie Mulville, who comes from Investing in Women and is their Business and Partnerships Director there, and can also share a little bit more from their practical experience, how they have been working in multiple ASEAN countries with private sector companies. And we do have, last but not least, Ravi Bhatnagar with us, who comes from Reckitt and who is not from an ASEAN country. But one thing I wanted to say, some of the research that we have done here for ASEAN, we have also been conducting for other countries. And we're really thrilled to have you here, Ravi, to provide a perspective not only from a South Asia perspective, but also particularly from a private sector perspective. So with no further ado, Joni, I'm going to start with you. And you have been working on this for a very long time. You have been with ILO for a very long time. And I just want to start a little bit forward with you. We've heard a lot about transparency and accountability, but in practicality, why is that now so important? Would it not be enough if companies just do things? Why do we need transparency and accountability mechanisms?
Well, thanks for asking this question, Katja. It's very nice to be here today, and we value our ongoing collaboration with UN Women under the EU-funded Responsible Supply Chain Program. I think the quick answer to that is why we need it. Well, we've had COVID, and we've had this for over a year. We've seen a further widening of inequalities, but we also saw before COVID that these gaps were not closing on their own. So across the last decades, we've seen that there have been some gains, but there has been a lot of stagnant areas, and part of that is due to this element of accountability and transparency. And we know that SMEs generate the bulk of jobs, and these are pointing to this importance of the private sector having an essential role to play, not only in job creation, but and delivering products and services, but as well providing safe, fair, productive environments for their staff and through their supply chains, and that includes on gender equality. So I think, you know, one of the growth areas, I would say, as going with what's being talked about in the report, is certainly the private sector's ability to implement all of these various commitments. And it's through transparent policies and programs that companies are becoming more competitive and efficient. And the report points out and has gathered a lot of the business case for gender equality, and then highlighted important data and the connection between gender equality and productivity. But we still have a lot of gaps in the implementation. And the report rightly points out that transparency leads to better results. What is clearly set as a goal to achieve then gets done and is now prioritized. And it's clear what needs to happen. So as we speak, as I say, COVID is widening those inequalities. We need to hold ourselves accountable to uphold standards that promote gender equality and inclusion, because it's good for business outcomes, but it's good for us all. And I wanted to highlight quickly the role of employers' organizations. And from the ILO side, we have employers' surveys that are referenced in the report that have shown that the majority of enterprises who track gender equality report a profit increase of 10 to 15% due to implementing gender equality initiatives. So they're really connecting and tracking with data how this is boosting their business. And as, of course, we know when that happens, it boosts the economy. And a lack of transparency and accountability to gender equality has made it difficult to see progress over the last decades. And all of these issues that are key for closing the gender gaps. I like to call it the unfinished business. These aren't new areas. These aren't areas that have not had commitments. These aren't areas where there are laws in place. There are still gaps, but there are so many areas where we just haven't delivered to scale, and therefore setting clear objectives, communicating them transparently, sharing information, and being accountable, it's the way to make progress in a significant matter on gender equality. Otherwise, we'll be talking about gender gaps for years to come, and that would be very sad. And also want to point out that through effective social dialogue between employers and workers, as well as with governments, which is a mandate of the ILO as a tripartite organizations. By coming together, this can also enhance transparency and stronger returns by coming to collective agreement that this is a priority. So this is, of course, including the private sector, but also expands out to make sure that the needs of women and workers are prioritized and taken into account, including their voice. And in addition to the obligations that all employers, public or private, have in upholding labor standards at the national level regarding safety, rights at work for their teams, but also in ensuring equal opportunity and non-discrimination within their enterprises. This happens through setting those clear, effective, and transparent policies, both at the national level, through the laws and legislation, but also through policies, programs, and practices at the enterprise level. And transparency is a means of leveling the playing field, and in particular for women and marginalized groups of workers. It's a clear means for companies to also deliver towards gender equality in the world of work. One small example linking up to one of those two key areas that came up on the cloud, linking to equal pay, is that, and this is brought out in the report as well, is that when companies share their pay scales transparently, so that staff knows what their category of job is paid, then they understand what the range is, and it makes an important difference in particular to women. Pay transparency is one of the most concrete areas of discrimination and gender-based discrimination, pay discrimination. So pay transparency in particular has implications because so many studies show that women often start their careers on a lower foot than men with the same competencies due to a lack of knowledge of their worth and often a discomfort in just asking that. So there are really practical means and guidance already out there on delivering on pay equity. And fair remuneration is something that companies and workers understand. Pay is really at the heart of a lot of the negotiations. Staff want to know that they're being treated fairly, and this has positive impacts on their loyalty, and again contributes up to productivity, but also increasing to contributing to the addressing the gender pay gap, which is about 20% average globally. And I'd like to share that there is an international coalition that actually was started up with ILO, UN Women, and OECD that reflects SDG 8.5, and it's called the Equal Pay Coalition, and you can find it at equalpaycoalition.org, and there you'll find a lot of resources and knowledge around what governments are doing, but also what companies are doing, and sharing of good practices, which is one of the things that the report does as well. It pulls out a lot of the practices, and that's a very important element for companies. They want to know what others are doing. And transparency and accountability allow everybody to know what's required, what's expected, how companies compare towards their competition. It helps society, consumers understand which companies are transparent and committed to upholding responsible business practices. And it's just signaling to staff, and in particular women workers, that their employer is fair and equitable. So the new report highlights many of these actions that can be taken, and a lot of these link up to ILO labor standards on key gender equality issues like equal pay, but also equal opportunity, work-family balance measures, maternity, paternity, and eliminating of violence and harassment, including gender-based violence. And these international labor standards provide companies with guidance, companies and countries with guidance on what minimally has been agreed internationally as a benchmark for addressing these issues in the workplace and in the law. And these are voted and adopted by governments, workers, and employers. So these are a commitment that has been agreed and negotiated, and allow for really that benchmark towards achieving the results. And the report that's been presented today highlights this room for growth in the area of sexual harassment. So I also wanted to share, there's good news on that as well. The World of Work recently adopted an international standard to address violence and harassment in the world of work, including gender-based violence, which is pervasive, and COVID has exacerbated it further. And we are about to launch a campaign. June 25th is the entry into force of this new convention and its accompanying recommendation. And I'd like to point out that within those, there is practical guidance on what can be done, both by governments, but also by employers, and really practical issues to take into account in their policies and programs. And all of this, just to close, is unfinished business, where we all have a role to play. There are standards, there are practices, there's guidance. The WEPs brings guidance as well. Many of the commitments have been made at the national level through laws, policies, ratification, but we need to implement these at the company level and close the remaining gaps by collaborating, partnering, and holding each other accountable for our commitments, bringing more transparency and accountability so that gender equality becomes a reality, and companies can and are making it happen and making it count on their bottom line and showing transparently what they are doing and what it's changing. So I'll stop there and hand back over to you, Katja. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joni. That was a very detailed analysis and reflection from your side. And I think we will be hearing more about, indeed, the ability of business to really shift or make sure that the unfinished business is going to be finished. But we've also heard in the report that there is a responsibility, or one of the recommendations was, how can we facilitate to create an enabling environment, and the importance of the public sector, the importance of regulations. And so we're going to come into this conversation a little bit more now, and I'm going to turn to Alba Phoon, who is joining us from the European Commission, who is obviously the umbrella for many country governments and many policymakers. And Alba, also, I think one of the conversations that I think would be great to have is knowing that the European Union and ASEAN particularly, since we're speaking about a report conducted in ASEAN, have a very strong trade relationship as well. So I would love to hear a little bit more from an EU perspective, knowing you have not been only a partner to this program, but also moving the needle when it comes to gender equality in terms of your new EU Gender Action Plan, but also looking into much more transparency when it comes also to other areas. So I would love to hear from you a little bit more. Why is this important to the EU, and how EU laws or the new Gender Action Plan or any kind of transparency and accountability laws can really enforce or really contribute to creating a more gender equal playing field for women in the economy. Over to you, Alba.
Thank you so much, Katja, and very, very pleased to and honored to join all of you in this discussion today. Indeed, Joni Simpson rightly referred to unfinished business, and I think we very much share the idea of it being unfinished business, and in fact there being a huge, strong pushback on gender equality overall, which really calls for attention and calls for action. And in the last year, the EU has adopted a number of new policies, new directives to address the issue of gender equality broadly, human rights, accountability, transparency, and new business practices. So let me elaborate a little bit on those more in detail, and in particular, I'd like to share the ambition of the new Gender Action Plan, which was adopted at the end of last year. So this new Gender Action Plan makes EU's ambition to lead by example. So really adopt at home, to practice at home what we preach in the world. And in this regard, the aim is that 85% of all the actions that we conduct globally, whether funded through development interventions or others, or in the trade area, that they contribute to women's empowerment. And I think this is a significant raise of level in the ambition. So before we were talking about a gender responsive approach at best, but now we are really at wanting to execute this new gender transformative approach from the EU side and see that play out in the ASEAN region as well through a number of measures taken. So the new gender action plan really puts an emphasis on women's economic empowerment in various ways, and lays out that the role of companies is significant, and its potential needs to be tapped into to really ensure that it supports the ambition on gender equality and women's rights more broadly. And this is where, of course, it's a very detailed action plan, but it especially puts a new kind of emphasis on what we monitor and how we monitor in this space. And I think that's why it's very interesting with these the new report, and how everything that well, indeed, the title of this session and what we really measure matters, and that's what get managed. And I think that's the same idea that we share with this new plan, that we need to monitor more in this space. And there's been quite a lot of efforts to develop now country level implementation plans for this gender action plan, and to see it play out on country level, and to really go into a level of details that allow us to then measure the results and see the results. This gender action plan also links to other areas of policy. So our human rights and democracy action plan, also adopted at the end of last year, is executed in tandem in a way. So it encourages our delegations and the EU as a whole to engage with the business sector on due diligence and accountability and access to remedy issues in a participatory manner. With a strong focus on supply chains, for instance, and these accountability and transparency. And I think that it kind of couples the gender action plan very well, because it emphasizes these multi-stakeholder processes, also bringing in civil society, human rights defenders, and that this collaboration needs to be strengthened across the board. So the EU really has I mean, there's also recent initiatives, the legislative initiative on sustainable corporate governance, which is just being planned, but which aims to introduce mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence across value chains, which of course also brings in a strong gender lens in it. So I think all of those actions, and how we then work on multilateral fora as the EU to drive these issues, but also put the financing where it matters. I mean, indeed, we are proud to fund these important projects on responsible business chains in Asia, and promoting empowerment of women at work, and also labor migration has been something that we support on women and workers in ASEAN. So there's a lot of initiatives that then are coupled and well, support these ambitions, and also are in line with our ambition on the whole.
Great. Thank you very much, Alva. May I ask one follow-up question to you? I've mentioned in the beginning, you were talking already about supply chains, and we were talking in the beginning very quickly on the importance of international trade between the EU and ASEAN, or Asia in a wider sense as well. How important are these kind of transparency and accountability measures for trade relationships, and what does it mean for the companies that are operating? I mean, there are a lot of European companies that we also work in the program with that are operating in Asia or have supply chains here. So how does this come together?
Yes, that's a very important and a good question, because of course we know that EU trade and investment agreements and policy are not gender neutral. So all of these measures and the current comprehensive trade agreements with their trade and sustainable development chapters really need to support really companies and women, and we need to see that play out in a new way. I think it's a significant development that now with the Chile negotiations and the gender provisions that have been committed to there, and the new commitment to really make gender equality issues a firmer part of all the future trade agreements. We're going to see that really play out in a new way and really see the scene change in the future. So I think we're going to need more analysis and monitoring of these economic and social dynamics required to develop effective trade policies that really support women and trade at the same time. But this will really be a key issue for all the EU delegations on the ground implementing these different policies, and more broadly with the countries that we continue negotiating different trade agreements with.
Great. Thank you so much, Alban. I think the picture becomes clearer and clearer. There is a lot which is going to change globally and in different parts of the world, which is good. But what we'll be seeing also here on the ground is a lot of the local governments and the local regulators are taking actions to ensure that transparency and accountability is assured. And I'll need to speed up a little bit in time, but I'm going to take, while we speak and do the panel already, Q&As in that I'll see coming in. But I'm going to be turning it to Nadia Zainuddin, who is the Deputy General Manager from the Security Commission in Malaysia, as we've heard before. And we're still staying in the regulation space. And Nadia, it would be great if you just very, very briefly could share with us on what is the role of the Security Commission, but really then share also with us a very good practice that we have seen and also mentioned in the report that Malaysia has been doing in 2017 while having a recommendation in their corporate code of governance on having 30% women in board. This was 2017. We are 4 years later almost. Please, could you share with us what happened since then, since you have made this guidance publicly? Over to you, Nadia.
Sure. Thank you, Katja. I'd first like to thank the host of the forum for the invitation. The SC is indeed very pleased to be able to be part of this conversation. Perhaps a quick introduction to the Securities Commission Malaysia. We are a self-funded statutory body with the responsibility, a dual responsibility to regulate and develop the Malaysian capital market. And part of this mandate is for us to supervise the stock exchange, Bursa Malaysia, and to regulate the corporate governance practices of companies listed on the exchange. Currently, we have over 900 listed companies on Bursa Malaysia. In terms of regulating corporate governance, including the participation of women on boards, this of course requires having in place a regulatory framework which promotes accountability and supports transparency So the Act, the listing rules, has all the mandatory requirements, including continuous disclosure obligations, which is of course critical to ensure there is transparency on these businesses and stakeholders have access to reliable information. Very quickly now, I'd just like to take a few minutes to touch on women on boards or women in leadership, which is one of the first few essential indicators under the WEPs framework. So for the Securities Commission Malaysia, the participation of women on boards has been a long-standing priority of the SC and part of our corporate governance mandate. And this really rests on the appreciation and understanding that the ability of boards to lead and steward effectively will depend on who's on the board or the board's composition. So particularly the participation of women on boards. This is not just true at the board level, but also in terms of the participation of women in management and across the company. So as the report highlighted, I think we have not used mandatory quotas. So there is no mandatory rule that every board of a listed company on Bursa Malaysia needs to have X number of women directors, but instead, the Malaysian Code on Corporate Governance recommends that boards comprise at least 30% women directors. There's a progression to this, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And companies need to disclose if they have achieved this target or otherwise. But so we have made gradual but steady progress. But I'd just like to share that in 2018, a big game changer for Malaysia, for the Securities Commission, in terms of improving our monitoring ability and enhancing transparency in terms of women participation, was when we began leveraging machine learning or text analytics to help us monitor the adoption of the best practices, including the achievement of the 30% target, and as well as the actual statistics. So previously, what was a very laborious, resource-intensive exercise, where we would probably have to go through the annual reports of these companies, has now been made more efficient and through the use of text analytics. And the outcome of that has been our ability to publish an annual publication called the Corporate Governance Monitor, which shares data on women participation on boards, senior management, whether it's in executive role or independent director positions, overall statistics on women participation across the top 100, across the entire listed company population. That's in terms of numbers, but also qualitative. We are also able to comment on the quality of corporate governance disclosures, particularly board policies in relation to the participation of women. And so this has been very helpful because, as the title of the panel states, what gets measured gets managed. And because of the availability of this information, we spark discussion on the issue. We also then, the stakeholders are then aware, whether it's shareholders, advocates, the boards themselves know where the gaps are. So I think these are among the measures which we hope will enable irreversible and sustainable change, as mentioned in the WEPs report, in terms of women participation, particularly in leadership roles. Katja, going to your second question on the code itself. She's right. So the code, the Malaysian Code on Corporate Governance, has been a very critical tool for the regulators to try and shape behavior and improve the corporate governance practices of our listed companies. It's 20 years old. It was first introduced in the year 2000. It has had 4 revisions, 2017 and 2007, 2012, 17, and 2021. It's really a progression. In 2012, we started by recommending that boards have a board diversity policy. That later became a mandatory requirement in the listing rules. In 2017, we progressed to encouraging large companies to have 30% women directors on their board. But what data showed was that in terms of progress to date, a significant number of companies which have achieved that target were mid and small cap companies. There were, of course, large companies, but quite a good number of small and mid cap companies had achieved 30% and more, in fact. So that showed us that there was a level of readiness and understanding, even among the small and mid cap companies, on the need and the business case to have women on boards, to set the tone at the top, and to also ensure that there's greater participation of women across the company, greater empowerment of women. And thus, in 2021, that led us to then progress that practice further, and now all boards are encouraged to have 30% women on their boards. Just a quick note as well. So because it's voluntary, it's a voluntary best practice. It's not a mandatory quota. There will be companies that fall short of that target. So we'd like to make this change and the commitment sustainable. So what is a requirement, what is mandatory for listed companies to do is, if they fall short of 30%, they need to explain why, and then what measures will they take to try to achieve that target, and by when. So the latest revision of the code states that, you know, it should be 3 years or less, because then what we found is that this flexibility, if some of the companies can be very vague in terms of the timeline, you know, the timelines could be very long, or vague in terms, and, you know, they will say as and when necessary that they will adopt the practice. So this is something that we found through our monitoring, which we've also shared through the reports. So we've had gradual but steady progress, but we really hope to accelerate it and to make sure that the momentum is sustainable. Thanks, Katja.
Thank you, Nadia. As I said, I'm going to be kind of combining Q&A already a little bit. We had one question that was coming in, and maybe you have a brief statement on this as well, Nadia, which is how have disclosure requirements have enabled greater compliance with human rights in Southeast Asia? I do think you have given a very well example from a gender perspective. Any other example you would want to share? If not, I'll come back to you later. But if you have,
well, I think in terms of say human rights condition, that is something that is included in our sustainability reporting framework, and it's included as one of the indicators which companies should discuss if the risk or the issue is material. And I think it's an interplay. There needs to be a disclosure requirement, but there also needs to be a role played by the stakeholders of that company in terms of getting that discussion on the agenda. So the disclosure is one, but the stakeholders, for example, the shareholders, need to respond accordingly to the information being provided or lack of, for example. So I think there's a multiplayer role here.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadia, for just taking this question as well. And I'm gonna turn to Katie Mulville, and Katie will be sharing with us much of her really rich experience working with companies or through the business coalitions that investing in women is supporting in different ASEAN countries. Katie, we have heard from Nadia, women in leadership is obviously one important indicator and one important action that really drives change. But you have been also working much deeper and in a wider sense also with companies on particularly their gender and workplace actions, policies, and also data. So I would love to hear from you a little bit.
Hi, Katja. I think we've lost. Hi, Katja. Sorry.
Yes, but I cut out for a minute. So very briefly, I hope you can hear me back. I really would love to hear would love you to share a little bit more on your work with the companies through the business coalitions that Investing in Women is supporting in several ASEAN countries. How do you work with them? How do you support them or incentivize them? What have you learned on how do they measure and report data?
Yeah, well, the whole Investing in Women program is very much founded on sort of data-driven change. We know from the work with our companies over the last 4 to 5 years that, you know, data is critical in order to assess company level, sort of in terms of current status in relation to workplace gender equality. We need that to inform action plans for the advancement of workplace gender equality. And then most importantly, we need to be able to measure progress over time. Investing in Women, which is an initiative of the Australian government, as Katja says, we support business coalitions in 4 countries. And those business coalitions are made up of private sector companies that are committed to advance workplace gender equality, both within their own workplace and in the wider business community. Now, I say that the program is built on data, or it's driven by data and evidence. And in the first phase of our program, we supported 40 companies in the countries where we work, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar. And those 40 companies became EDGE certified, and that's a globally recognized certification system for gender equality. Now, that gave us a very rich data source in terms of HR data, policy and practices data, and staff perceptions from over 125,000 employees. That data not only gave us sort of a benchmark in terms of where the companies were in those countries, where the member companies were, but also we learned an awful lot about the capability and maturity of company HR departments within the markets where we were working. And also we learned a lot about what type of strategies and tools are actually appropriate, what works. Now, in the more recent part of the program, we've extended the range of tools we have, and we needed to do that to reflect the sort of maturity of those HR departments, were less mature, say, than in developed markets, and therefore some of the tools, some of the assessment processes were difficult for the companies to easily comply with. Now, we keep saying we want companies to gather and report on data, but we also need to recognize that we need to make that as easy as we can for companies. And we need to also incentivize the companies to want to engage with us. So we believe very much in our work at IW that we need to work from the bottom up, so at the company level up, as well as working with regulators to add further incentives in terms of them actually reporting on the data. Now, in terms of how do we incentivize companies to actually work with us, and that's very much around building the business case. And it was great for Joni to refer to some of the ILO research where, ILO has been able to gather evidence from companies themselves who are actually saying, yes, we can point to the business benefits of workplace gender equality. Now, that sort of evidence is lacking in many of the markets where we work, in fact, in all of them. And I would say across ASEAN, maybe less so in Malaysia, but I think in many of the other markets, the evidence is lacking. And we need the data to build the business case, to encourage companies to want to measure where they are in terms of workplace gender equality, and to be able to then measure that and report on that progress. And to do that, we need to show them that these tangible benefits exist. Without data, it's not just companies that are going to it's harder for companies to implement change. We need that data, as we've heard, for governments and policymakers to be able to look also and report and see what's actually working, and then also to identify the best practice. That's a very important part of the work of the coalitions that we work with, is I've heard some of the presenters talk about an enabling environment in order for companies to report. I think the work of the BCs is very much about that enabling environment, providing strategies, providing advice, creating role models, and so that the private sector can lead this change themselves. And we have the evidence it works. The majority of the companies with whom we have worked and who have gathered data to assess where they are in terms of WE progress have all reported, they've made progress in at least one area of workplace gender equality. we're working very closely with UN Women and the accountability, transparency accountability framework, I think, is an incredibly useful tool. What we really need to do is to have a core set of indicators so that countries are reporting against the same standards. That's going to help us to compare and contrast, not just between companies, but between countries. Also, we have a lot of experience in the countries where we are of actually working with regulators around the type of criteria that should be implemented. And the minimum standards that is within the transparency and accountability framework is very, very helpful. It means that all the efforts from all the stakeholders in the different countries can use a common framework. We can use the same arguments, and that because of the report has evidence that's been gathered at an ASEAN level, we're able to combine that with our evidence, concrete evidence at the company level and within the countries. And I think that the partnership between all the stakeholders is really going to be the way we move forward. We get the companies committing to undertaking to gather the data and to use it in a concrete and useful way to enable them to harness the business advantage of workplace gender equality. And then we work together sort of around a common framework with regulators and governments and policymakers, so we can actually also demonstrate the advantage from their perspective. Thanks, Katja.
Thanks, Katie. As always, very practical and insightful as well. I was in parallel looking a little bit to what questions we are getting in, and I'm just gonna answer the ones that are quickly to answer. The public, is the report public available? I think we're gonna be sharing the report in the chat, and it's launched today, so it will be publicly available. Katie, I don't know if you want to take this one maybe before I turn to Ravi, who we definitely want to hear and who will be able to talk to this probably as well. Are there some examples of good practices or ways to have good practices of any companies, listed companies in reporting on D&I or gender issues as part of their mandatory reporting? Have you kind of come across really good examples, Katie, through your work?
Well, in terms of mandatory reporting in the countries where we're working, the only requirement is for sex disaggregated data around workforce participation, and so we're still working very much around the mandatory reporting. I think there are good examples of companies who are voluntarily reporting and actually looking at and reporting on the efforts that they've introduced in terms of workplace gender equality. I think the best type of reports are those that actually set themselves targets, and that's very similar to what we heard in Malaysia. We don't, workplace gender equality isn't a done deal. Even if you've made improvements, there is always room for more improvement, and we see that even with companies like Unilever or Accenture and those who are well known already for their D&I programs. They will have annual targets and annual action plans and strategies. So I think that that's critically important, and I would certainly say encouraging companies to report what they're doing, but also then to set themselves target for how they can further advance workplace gender equality is really how we're going to drive change. I think if we look at sort of goals around pay equity and reporting around this, we know we have a long way to go. So maybe having set actions and requiring companies to set out their action plans, how they might work towards those goals, even if they can't meet them now, is the way to move forward. Thanks, Katja.
Thanks, Katie. And Ravi, I'm going to be turning it to you, and you see there's a big interest also looking really through the questions. People are really want to know what companies are effectively doing. And I know you are just a great example on sharing probably very practical first-hand experience from Reckitt's perspective, with whom you have been for the last 7 years. So I'm sure you can be also sharing a little bit of a journey in that. But first of all, I just wanted to start maybe, Ravi, and thank you for joining us from India. And we've been having conversations with you and with our colleagues as well. And I think you, for the moment, just feeling again sort of the impacts also on the pandemic. And we have discussed this before and seeing particularly impacts that women had through the pandemic and still having. And we were discussing on how can we ensure when building back to get building back better and more inclusive. What can companies like Reckitt do, or what are you doing currently to really institutionalize the frameworks or really make sure that measures are taken, but then also reported on and goals are set so that we really build more resilient businesses? Anything you would like to share what Reckitt is doing to really advance this really important work?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's very exciting to hear. Yes, definitely. This whole pandemic of COVID-19 has taken the work on the gender. There's a back turn on that. Significant investments are required so that the work comes on track, and we're all working towards it. And my 7 years journey in Reckitt has been fantastic, where I was able to see first time a gender pay comprehensive report to date in year 2020, where we started covering the 10 markets, which like what Kathy rightly said, it's important to go to the markets. It's important, there are some compulsory markets which ask for the reporting relationships, and there are certain markets where there are no norms as of now. So our gender pay report, which we did in 2020, actually had 10 markets, 10 big markets for Reckitt, which also means like the 70% of the universe was actually covered through our work, which included Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Poland, Russia, Thailand, UK, and US. Some of the markets are there where you have to compulsorily report, but there are certain markets like India and others where you just need you need to just present the number of men and women only in the business. Something which is of utmost importance as basically measuring it and measuring it right. So some of the when we reached out to 70% of the universe in Reckitt on the gender gaps and pay performance and the bonus performance and the mean bonus gaps, we found when we reached the indicators like the median gender pay, like the mean gender pay gap, the median gender bonus, the mean bonus gap, the proportion of men and women receiving a bonus payment, then the women and men working in manufacturing, then the total number of employees, and the proportion of employees working in the manufacturing. All these indicators are very important indicators because they reflect on the hygiene of the company. And this it's basically these statistics are very important, and you can see like country by country how things are changing. You can also see like region by region how things are changing, and what's the way forward. And also we have also seen some of the snapshots once this report was out. A lot of media houses also came forward, and they also started asking about so okay, it's not great at all the places. There's some places where the company really has to you really have to do double the job, have to improvise. So what are the plans? And as Kathy rightly says, let's you need to put the plans in place. One of the big plans is by 2022, there will be 50% of the senior managers who will be women in the company, which accounts to around 50% of the employees in the company. Then along with this, there are other things like when we talk about gender pay gap and other things, we also can't ignore the things like inclusion, and the pillars on which the whole discussion on inclusion, diversity, and gender should be there. So the pillars, to best of my knowledge, like if I have to do it, or like how we do it in Reckitt, is like there are 6 pillars: leadership, people, places, procurement, brands, and partnerships. It completes almost everything, like, which needs to be there. They're the essential ingredients which needs to be there. The level of effort, it needs to be put differently on the different things, but definitely there is a will to do it. There is a will to change. In last 7 years, like, this is the first time in 2020 I saw this report, and we are working on it. And we are getting huge interest from the women folks, especially in the manufacturing, because one of the data came, like, in India, the countries like India has just 1% of the women in the manufacturing sector working with Reckitt. How we can make it a better workplace? How we can move it from the band-aid solutions, and we give something which is holistic, which is something which is more comprehensive, which is basically, which is going to stay. It should not be a fad, it should be a fashion. So we're working towards it, like, how we can have more gender responsive programming. And definitely these data, these numbers, they're a good reflection on the leaders, on the leadership, as well as the capacities and the capabilities of the organizations. It put the governance structures more strongly. It helped people think what is to be done, how it is to be think, and how fast. Uh, one more perspective to this is, like, when these reports reach to the employees internally, they also start reading it. They start questioning it. They start asking us, where do I fall in the bell curve? So why bell curve closes for me, and why bell curve opens for me, and why, like, only 2 women can be promoted out of 50, and why not more? So, this all data generates a lot of excitement, a lot of questions, a lot of transparency and governance. It challenges the leadership. It challenges the leadership basically to think about, so what next? Because now, if the indicators dip in 2021, so there is a huge accountability. So there is a shareholder value. There are stakeholders. There are internal stakeholders. So, like, UN is looking at us, and all the stakeholders who are in this forum, on the screen, off the screen, they're listening to me. They will be asking us, okay, you talked very big in 2020. So what's happening in 2021? What suddenly changed? So, when you publish the numbers, they are not just the numbers. I often use the statement, use it or lose it. I'm just repeating it again, use it or lose it. So these numbers are so important. Like, there are several of the missed opportunities. If these numbers are not used, on the regular basis, if these numbers are not used for the decision making, and the loss is huge. The loss is not just huge to the women. The loss is huge to the companies, to the corporations, because, I'm personally observing, like, the leaderships where women are there. So how they differently behave when the boards have more women and more inclusion and inclusivity. How things different, how decisions are taken differently, and it's very beautiful. Like, and this happens to be a Pride month also. Like, yesterday was the first day of the Pride month. I'm seeing a lot of women celebrating the Pride month in my organization, across the borders. It also gives a lot of strength. Like, we are not just restricting ourselves to the so-called gender stereotyping and the gender agenda. It's much beyond that. It's much bigger, and we all have a role to play, small or big. That's what I wanted to submit.
Thank you very much for this very open sharing, Ravi, in terms of what you have done. And also, I really like that perspective. Once the data is there, it needs to get measured, and people will look at it internally and externally. So it creates a sense of responsibility and accountability. So I think this is also what we started the session with, right? What gets measured gets done. So we really kind of need to work on this. We have heard from you from gender pay gap, and a great example. We've heard from Nadia, a great example of women leadership, who are all kind of things that are part of what we call the essential indicators, the ones where we really think we should get the majority behind that and get companies mandatory to report on them. I think then we will be able to also really shift the needle. And I know we are 2 minutes for closure, and I have been trying to really get the questions into the conversation while we were speaking. I have one to close, which I'm going to be putting to Nadia, because we know there's a guideline now, or there are research evidence out there. What are the indicators? We've heard from Ravi how could they be measured. But we have also heard, in order to really change, we need to really create systemic change and really make this mandatory or make this established, institutionalized in regulations and or policies. So Nadia, I have one question for you, which comes out of the audience. How can we get more stock exchange commissions like yours to really start that journey? How can we mobilize others? Let's start maybe in ASEAN. What is a very concrete step we could take to really incentivize other stock exchange commissions?
Well, I think, to be fair, a number of stock exchanges in ASEAN are taking measures of their own. I think the Ring the Bell initiative by the Sustainable Stock Exchanges is one such effort, right? And I think a lot of the ASEAN exchanges are involved in that. But I think more and more, as the conversation deepens and there's greater push and demand from various stakeholders, including the institutional investors, to see more women participation, empowerment, the stock exchanges will respond accordingly. And these initiatives will make their way into the regulation, into the framework. But I just really wanted to add that there is really an ecosystem to this. I think regulation is part of it, corporate disclosures, the reporting as one aspect, but you really need the other stakeholders to also play a role, because the information is not just there for the sake of it. Someone needs to respond and take the necessary action. So for example, in the case of women on boards, it's the shareholders. If there's lack of action to get the right women on the board, there's no diversity in senior management, very poor policies in terms of for women employees, then shareholders should respond and get that conversation going with the board. So it's an ecosystem that needs to work together.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And I think I'm going to be closing this. And it's also an ecosystem landscaping, which we have been doing to really look at this and how can we advance this. So I'm going to close it down with encouraging our listeners and everyone to really have a look in the report and take out also very practical examples and actions there. And I would love to really thank the panel for your very open conversation. I know we have heard very honestly feedback from some of you and really your experience. And I hope that sets us for a good conversation over the next months and to really deepen that agenda on transparency and accountability. Thank you very much, everyone, and wishing everyone who's out there a good rest of the day and a good rest of the Business and Human Rights Forum, and hope you join us on multiple other sessions as well. Thank you very much, everyone.